I know some of you were waiting for my feedback regarding the bits and bytes expert that the Commonwealth has employed. So, while we're waiting for the law tubers to catch up and get their videos out so we can create a mashup, here's my reaction to today's newest shenanigans that only expose Mr. Brennan as just as big a fraud as Lowy.
As a matter of background, as I think the court is likely aware, the Commonwealth tested information on data chips that were found in different modules that were inside the defendant's Lexus. Inevitably, at trial, the court is likely aware that there's information taken from one of the systems that was provided, and it showed information such as key cycles and different speeds. And I understand that was a exhibit at trial.
Oh, so you mean the exhibits that Trooper Paul used, which were missing a timestamp column, those ones?
There were two different search warrants by the government. One search warrant was for the car that included both a telestream and a telematics module, which is like a lunchbox with computer panels in them. And then in 2023, there was a second search warrant for the infotainment system, which is what was produced at trial. I hired an independent expert, and in the independent expert of the information, what he realized is that the information taken from the informatics manual and the information taken from the telestream manual had some irregularities.
Irregularities? So if I showed you a 1-inch piece of string and you argued that it's actually a foot long, and then I show you with a ruler that is actually only 1 inch, and in fact 12 of them would make a foot, is that an irregularity? Sir, please.
What he realized is that all of that data was unreadable. And so initially he thought that the data was not fully downloaded or compiled. He checked and he believed that gigabits were gigabytes and that there was a discrepancy. And the reason he thought this is because there was very obvious information missing from that procedure.
Oh, I see. It's the string's fault that he can't tell that it's only 1 inch long.
There was information including navigation information, information regarding phones that were plugged into the radio, travel logs, things that are particularly relevant and material in this case, information that is going to be extraordinarily inculpatory or exculpatory in this case. And so after he realized his oversight on the gigabit, he filed a supplemental report. And what we learned is not only was the chips that were taken from the telematics and infotainment systems and downloaded were read with the wrong reader.
Oh, it's the ruler's fault.
So that way the information was not available. Also, in the the infotainment system, there were actually 3 boards, not 1. Only 1 was taken out. So there is a plethora of information on these chips that has not been downloaded that's relevant to this case.
Ooh, a plethora of CMOS information. For those who are unfamiliar, the CMOS is the firmware that runs the infotainment system. It doesn't store any information about the user.
And so we provided notice to the defense that our intention is that we are going to test this information that we have in our control and that we have a search warrant for. And my effort was to give them notice so they could have an available expert. So my purpose really was not to ask for the defense's permission, rather it was to notice them this is what we were going to do.
So are you saying that equal access is not a given in Massachusetts? Dictator Brennan?
You can see from my motion I asked to do it within 14 days. Having recently arrived at the case, it was important for me to prioritize Rule 17 motions and new experts so that they could have adequate notice. The defense asked for today's date and wanted more time, and when I considered it, I thought that was reasonable. I think they're entitled to have an expert and consider what we are doing, even though I don't believe they have standing to prevent it.
But they're not trying to prevent it, Dictator Brennan. And you know that because you read their motion. They're actually all for it, so long as they have equal access.
And so that's why I agreed to this date. Inevitably, we know that this information will be on these chips. And so we know there are 2 boards on the system that weren't tested.
Yeah, they weren't tested because they contain firmware, not the information that you're after. But hey, if you want to know how the telematics system turns on the video screen and turns it off again, I guess that's your prerogative.
And then the other chips that were tested that came back with unreadable information, with the proper computer programs, they call them programmers, we will get viable information from both of them.
If I remember correctly, Trooper Guarino said during his testimony that Burla hadn't yet released a version of the software that could read these particular chips. He said something like, "We'd been waiting months and months for Burla to give us the new software update." Well, I checked that Burla update, and guess what? It came out 2.5 weeks after he did the destructive chip-off process. So if Burla were keeping him updated and he knew that it was 2 weeks away, why didn't he wait?
And so I've spoken to the defense. I know they've hired an expert. I know they've filed a motion contesting our position. I'm not going to speak for what their position is today. But I would say 2 things. One, the defense in their motion asks to have their expert be able to intervene. We're not agreeable to that. They can watch and comment and criticize as much as they'd want, but we're entitled to the download.
I would argue they're entitled to the download untampered with. I would add though, they're not contesting your motion. They're agreeing to your motion. They're also agreeing to stand by and watching until your dumbass expert looks like he's going to screw something up. That's the only place that you differ.
Notably, when the first download was done, the Commonwealth deferred to the defense expert to do the download. That is not my position. I don't defer that responsibility. But it was the defense expert that overlooked the proper reader that was needed for the chips that were tested, and it was the expert that overlooked the fact that there was 3 panels in the system, not 2.
Well, that's interesting because I seem to recall Trooper Guarino testifying that it was he who did the testing. And it was he who rang up Burla and said, "We're not getting anything legible from the data." I could be wrong. It might have been Miss Gaffney who did it, but I'm pretty sure that that's what Trooper Guarino testified to.
And our expert was astute enough to find those oversights, and that's why we now have an independent expert that is going to do this.
Astute, you say? You're talking about the dude who looked at the 1-inch piece of string and said it was a foot long? I think that's the opposite of astute. What is the opposite of astute? Oh yeah, stupid.
I know experts differ. They're not frick-a-frack. They all have different opinions, but we've attached all of the protocol.
Oh my god, dude, it's math. It doesn't differ. You either know how to math or you don't. 8 bits equals 1 byte. Just like 12 inches equals 1 foot. You can either do the math or you can't. It's not an opinion.
What we intend on doing, and the reason I brought it before the court, is I wanted to expedite this matter. It's important, and it does.
I thought we were going to have that hearing within 14 days when we first got the motion, and then Mr. McDermott told me that the defense was looking for more time, so we gave this.
Ooh, Arnie Bev interrupted him and chewed him out. Wonder how long that lasts.
We're far into the case is scheduled currently for January 27th. Sounds like you have a lot to do before then. But as of right now, it's still January 27th. So all of these things, the Rule 17 motions, all of these things need to be done as soon as possible. So.
Well, there you go. It lasted all of 10 seconds, and then she folded. Oh, you poor little things. You just have to do it soon as possible.
I understand. And if I can just add, 'cause it might help in your consideration of a later motion. The reason why this is urgent to me to have this as soon as possible is because I also have noticed and hired an accident reconstruction expert. And that accident reconstruction expert will necessarily rely upon the information that is gleaned from this testing.
Ruh-roll. Trooper Paul, you've been side-benched, mate. I wonder if they had to go to India to find his replacement.
How long is this testing going to take?
It's a 3-day testing. It will take within a week to read it. And the sooner we have it, the sooner we can have our reconstruction expert engage in any type of task that we want them to. But they necessarily are in a holding pattern now. And that is my sense of urgency for this to be developed and done.
Who's arguing this for the defense? Okay, I'll hear you, Mr. Jackson.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Woohoo, Mr. Jackson, coming in hot and heavy with the beard, eh?
I'll start by saying, in principle, we don't have an objection to the retesting of the telematics or the infotainment center or system data. The problem that we have, our issue, sort of dovetails into what Mr. Brennan was suggesting about what was done the first time. He just suggested that his new expert, Mr. Shannon Burgess, was astute enough to find something that Maggie Gaffney didn't find. Well, to bring the court completely up to speed.
Yeah, I don't think bringing the court up to speed is possible, AJ, but give it your best shot, mate.
When the initial testing was done, the Commonwealth's expert did not know how to do a chip-off, physically did not know how to do it, Joe Paul. He turned to Maggie Gaffney, our expert, who did know how to do it. She's a former NSP officer and extremely facile in this world.
Wait, she's former state police? The Commonwealth is throwing shade on one of their own former state police? Yikes.
And you have a different expert now. You're not using her now?
Well, we may use her, but we have an additional expert who specifically works, Mr. DeSorga.
Matty D, come on down.
Specifically works in chip-offs and chip-ons.
Wax on, wax off.
That physical procedure of moving chips on and off of boards. It's a very technical procedure. It's a very skilled procedure.
Wax on, wax off.
He knows how to do it. He's got an extremely long resume, having done this kind of work.
I read it.
We're bringing him up to speed in order to sort of engage it in some oversight and some observation. I don't have a principled objection to doing the retesting. What I have a problem with is that their new expert, Mr. Burgess, right at the beginning, fundamentally misunderstood the data set on the 3 chips, the 2-micron chips and the spansion chip that he looked at, didn't understand the difference between megabytes and megabits, gigabytes and gigabits.
Clearly he doesn't understand the difference between firmware and data storage either.
And that gave us pause. If he didn't understand that, which is at the foundation of reading the data, we're concerned that some of the data could be destroyed in whatever process he engages in. Like I said, we don't have a principled objection to the work that's going to be done. We simply want to make sure that nothing is destroyed in doing that work.
Yeah, we're afraid he's gonna F it all up.
It's not, and I would take a little issue with something Mr. Brennan said, it's not that the data set is missing information. We don't know that it's missing information. Burla has now updated software that we believe, I think both sides believe, could be beneficial in culling or teasing out that data set from those chips that didn't exist when Ms. Gaffney did her work previously. She put it on a reader, it was unreadable.
So there you go. Miss Gaffney did try to read the data, but obviously Trooper Guarino also tried to read the data. Again, throwing shade on one of their own.
It doesn't mean that the data is missing. It means that it's unreadable. As a matter of fact, one of the things that our expert would do and would suggest is that a process called a checksum be done. I'm going to use some made-up numbers, but let's say there's 5,123 bits or bytes on a particular chip. You can do a checksum and determine that there's 5,123 bits and bytes read now. That means down to the bit or the byte, nothing has been altered, nothing's been changed, and we know that we're dealing with the exact same data set.
I have showed you previously a number of times what that checksum should look like. It was demonstrated with a picture of a koala, and I changed 1 pixel of colour in the eyes and then saved it again, and it got a new number, or new MD5 value. So if I compared the original picture of the koala, the MD5s wouldn't match.
That checksum would be the first process in doing the additional reading. Then they can go back and use the additional Burla software to see if the data set could be read. After that's done, then my understanding is there would need to be a chip on. They'd need to resolder those specific chips, the 2-micron chips and the spansion chip, back onto the motherboard, install the motherboard back into the truck, and then turn the truck on. That's the process that I understand. My only request is that our expert obviously, given his expertise and his knowledge of this information, he should be there to observe. And the only caveat to that is if he makes a determination, working with Mr. Burgess or observing Mr. Burgess's work, that what's about to happen is destructive to the data on the chips,
i.e., he's doing something that might F it all up,
we would ask gently, and I don't think this is much of an ask, that he be allowed to interpose his objection to moving forward, contact both counsel, both parties, and if need be, present his objections either to us to resolve it or to the court for intervention. That's all. I want the work done, but I want to make sure that the data set that is on those 3 chips or additional chips that are read is never destroyed or in peril of being destroyed. That's all.
All right. Any response, Mr. Brennan?
The defense expert would not be working with Mr. Burgess. He'd be observing Mr. Burgess. The defense expert has no active role in this testing.
The defense never asked for that, Dictator Brennan. The defense only asked to interject or object if you guys look like you're gonna F it all up.
There is no inherent risk that Mr. Burgess is going to destroy something unnecessarily. This is potentially destructive testing, just as it was the first time. Fortunately, the information was not destroyed the first time, so we can access it again, but it's potentially destructive testing.
Yeah, potentially destructive testing, just like DNA, where both the defense and the prosecution are allowed to test it. Dictator Brennan.
The defense is not entitled to veto power during the process. That will delay things. It has no role and no purpose in it.
Veto power? What are we doing, taking votes at the United Nations Security Council? Veto power. Dictator Brennan did just say veto power.
And so, inevitably, Mr. Burgess is well qualified. Mr. Burgess is competent.
Competent? Sir, Mr. Burgess couldn't even tell us how many bits are in a byte. Competent is not a word that I would be using. What's the opposite to competent? Oh yeah, incompetent.
And he is going to test these chips and provide the information to the defense. They'll get an exact copy. The idea of checksum, there's no mystery to these words. There's a protocol that's followed where they use the old software that was ineffective, and they test to make sure it's the same amount of data that's unreadable. And after they confirm that nothing has been moved or destroyed or tampered with, then they bring in the right programs, the right software, and they'll retest it properly. It'll provide the information that will be available to both us and the defense.
So, essentially, they agree that the previous testing by Gaffney produced unreadable data because the Bella software hadn't been updated to include those chips yet. They both agree to the retesting, the process for retesting, who will do the retesting, with one caveat that the defense can intervene if they F it all up. And they both agree to the checksum process to make sure that the data that they've got is the same as the data still on the chips. But the Commonwealth stupidly believes they're going to get more data. And all the little minions are running around going, "Oh goody, more data." No, idiots, there is no more data. It's basic maths. If you only have a 1-inch piece of string, no matter what you do with that 1-inch piece of string, you're still going to have a 1-inch piece of string. It doesn't turn into a 1-foot piece of string just because you want it to be so. And also, you're not going to find any user information in the CMOS firmware. That is just ridiculous. I mean, you're going to get data, but it ain't going to be user data. It's going to be firmware. And it's going to be the exact same firmware that is distributed across all of the Toyota Lexus models with that infotainment system. Man, I would pay to be a fly on the wall when they discover that they just went to all that effort to extract the firmware. I could probably download a copy of it right now off the internet. Anyway, that chip aside, it is going to be interesting to see how they remove, delete, destroy any of the GPS data that exonerates Karen. Because I am 1,000% sure that if that data exists, that's exactly what it will do.